information correspondent for Reuters and AFP. He's a regular commentator on Indonesian politics and foreign policy, as well as a changing media landscape, and his opinion pieces have appeared obviously in the Jakarta Post, but also many international publications like the Straits Times of Singapore, New York Times, and many others. He's involved with various media organizations. He's currently the executive director of the International Association of Religion Journalists, which he helped to found in 2012. He's also active in organizing English writing workshops for professionals, and has held various fellowships during his career, including a senior fellowship at the East-West Center in Washington, a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, and the Jefferson Fellowship at the East-West Center in Hawaii. So that's Andy. Next to him is Nasser Wadadi, who's a Mauritanian-American consultant with expert knowledge of social media, is directly involved in issues of violent extremism in terms of understanding and dealing with those issues, and indeed with violent extremists, and politics of the Arab region and West Africa. He describes this as a brilliant description of a crossroads of public diplomacy, radicalization, and youth movements. And he's been identified as one of the top 5 influencers during the 2011 uprisings by the Atlantic magazine, voted best person to follow Arabic and Deutsche Welle's Best of Blogs Awards in 2013, named among 100 most powerful Arabs under 40 by the Arabian Business magazine in 2015. And he's the co-editor of the Palgrave Macmillan anthology, Arab Spring Dreams. And he's also been published widely, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe. And finally, Dr. Courtney Raj is the advocacy director of a committee to protect journalists. And as a journalist, researcher, and freedom of expression advocate, she writes and speaks frequently on the nexus of technology, journalism, and rights. She is the author of Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, Digital Dissidence and Political Change. And she has led advocacy missions to more than a dozen countries, UN bodies, the Internet Governance Forum, and has held positions with UNESCO, Freedom House, Al Arabiya, Daily Star in Lebanon, and the New York Times. What I want to do is just spend 5 minutes doing right at the start of this conversation is to map out what I think is kind of where we are on the whole media development take on the relationship between media development, strategic communication, and violent extremism. And then we can spend a bit of time interrogating that and adding to it. So clearly the issue we're talking about this morning is of real concern to media support organizations, and there's already been quite a few meetings and discussions around this within our community. GFMD hosted a meeting earlier in the year in Brussels to discuss the media development response to the growing agenda around countering violent extremism and particularly counter-narratives. Ayman Manna and myself presented at a major UNDP conference which was organized to map out and concretize and put flesh on the UN Secretary General's strategy around preventing violent extremism. Both of us talked about it, and I think it had quite a big influence on how they're seeing the role of media. There's many GFMD members who are producing analysis. I just saw one launched last night, I think, or from International Media Support. And there's many others who are producing analysis on the whole relationship between media and violent extremism. So there's been a lot going on this already, so I kind of want to start the conversation from where I think it's at. I may be wrong, and we'll get to that. But I just want to make 5 points. The first, we're clearly in an age where violent extremism is on the rise, and the use by violent extremist organizations of communication, especially through social media, is widely perceived in the diplomatic and the development and international communities to be highly sophisticated and highly effective. Many governments have come to believe that unless they find a way of countering extremist propaganda, they will fail in their efforts to curb radicalization and violence. Second, this is leading to an increase in support to communication efforts designed to counter the narrative of extremist organizations. And the concern, I think, within the media development community is that these efforts to counter the narrative of extremist organizations to deploy what some would call counter-propaganda is diverting both money and attention away from efforts to support the development of a free and independent media. And many donors appear to be switching money away from support. We heard a little bit about this in one of the sessions yesterday, from, for example, freedom of expression towards countering radicalization. So this is directly affecting the media development community. It's affecting international priorities in a way that it seems to be undermining the potential to support independent media. Third, there is a perspective, I think, within the media development community that the evidence does not support a counter-narrative approach. The argument is increasingly made that countering propaganda with extremist propaganda with another set of propaganda does not appear to work. Last year, we at BBC Media Action hosted a fellow who spent 4 months, and she was actually appointed by something called the Research Partnership for Conflict, Crime and Security to examine the evidence base in this area, and she could find little or no evidence that a counter-narrative approach worked. She did find some evidence that media development efforts might be more promising, but again, she found little evidence that a counter-narrative approach worked. And there's a feeling that that view is increasingly quite widely shared, not just within the media development community, but also amongst many of the donors who are supporting counter-radicalization and counter-narratives. And certainly a lot of the conversations I've been involved in have sort of suggested that, yes, we know that there are real limitations to a counter-narrative approach, but we have to be seen to be doing something. And that's why we are diverting money, if we are, from support to independent media towards a counter-narrative approach. But we also have to accept, and I think this is another perspective I think that is widely shared within the media development community, we'll find out, there is actually not very much evidence to suggest that media development and what the people in this room do reduces violent extremism. And certainly very few people, I suspect, I certainly wouldn't, in this room would claim, there are some, including on a panel, but there's very few people in this room, I would argue, who would claim to be experts on extremism or how to tackle it. And so we may believe that independent media has relevance to this issue, and we may believe that counter-narratives and a counter-propaganda approach does not work. But how do we know? And what's our expertise in this area? But I think many of us would argue that nevertheless, supporting independent, trusted media, providing independent platforms for inclusive public debate, creating avenues through which marginalized voices, politically marginalized, economically marginalized voices can be aired, populating public debate with facts, all these kinds of interventions by media support organizations would seem to be important contributors to reducing violent extremism. And while there is certainly evidence that a lot of what we do has an impact on reducing conflict, as again, is there so much evidence that it's actually reducing violent extremism? But I think there's a widespread belief that that is the case. And I think the final argument coming from the media support community, which I think is increasingly being made, is that there is increasing evidence that corruption fuels radicalization and fuels extremism. And there is also increasing evidence, and BBC Media Action has just produced a report on corruption in the media, but increasing evidence that an independent media remains one of the most effective deterrents to corruption. And so that those state efforts that are being made to contain or constrain the media in the name of countering radicalization or in the name of increasing stability, if, as many of them are endangering the independence of the media and its capacity to hold authority to account and to deter and curb corruption, then there is a strong argument to be made that those steps are, in fact, adding fuel to the fire of radicalization rather than actually containing it. So, in a nutshell, That's where I think some of the debate has got to. We will find out whether any of that actually makes any sense or not, and but to the extent to which it's limited. But just from the kind of discussions with Eamon Manor organized in Brussels and some of the other discussions, that's kind of where I think some of the discussions has got to. So Andy, I want to start with you, and from an Indonesian perspective, and just the basic question first, what actually is the role of media as you see it in relation to violent extremism?
Thank you, and good morning to you all. And I'd like to also extend welcome to Indonesia. We talk about the threat of terrorism. I can assure you that at the moment, as we speak now, the threat of terrorism is at the lowest level. We have a police officer here who will testify that. We have this conference here in Serpong, but if you have it in Jakarta, you would see the conference halls or the hotels you stay with all the metal detectors. Yeah. So basically, the threat of terrorism is still here in Indonesia, but at the moment, I can tell it's at the lowest level. And this is because of the great work of the police, our police force. We have had 3 minor, I wouldn't say minor, but they were, in terms of the fatalities, they were minor terrorist attacks this year. In January, there was the one in the main street of Jakarta, and there were four civilians died, but the 4 perpetrators, they were also killed. After that, there had been one a lone suicide bomber who killed himself and nobody else. And there was another one quite recently. The point is that the threat of terrorism has been with us all the time since we had the biggest and the most devastating attack in Bali, I think in 2001. But the threat of terrorism goes up and down. And part of that, why we have seen a low level of threat, is because I think the police have learned a lot from the lessons of Bali. Our intelligence are also very much active in anticipating attacks. There have been a series of plots, to assassinate the president, to blow up the Parliament House, and all those things. But they were anticipated and they will fall before they took place. Now, with regard to the media, where does the media fit in this picture? Well, the problem when we talk about the media is now we have so many players. Yeah? It's not just the mainstream, the established or traditional media. We have the social media, the internet, where there are so many players putting out their story, their versions, their propaganda. So if we are expecting that the media to play a role in reducing or preventing or dealing with radicalization, extremism, I think we are expecting a little bit too much. We will play our role. I think that the media, my paper, I'm sure most newspapers and media in Indonesia, we are part of our community. So we want to see our nation in peace. We want to see this threat of terrorism dealt with. So from that perspective, we are part of that effort to fight terrorism, to fight the increase of radicalization and extremism. But the question is, how do we do that? I don't think we have a specific strategy in dealing with that. Each of us have our own policies on dealing with this. I can share with you the Jakarta Post. We are not giving space to the voice of the radicals. The problem is the radicals and the extremists, they are very media savvy. They exploit the media, and they use us very often to get their message out, and we fell for it. One example is the case of Abu Bakar Bashir. He's now in jail, but for the second time. But the earlier one, he was serving time for a minor offense, not terrorism, but for citizenship papers. So he was in jail, and he made himself available for interviews, and it was CNN, BBC, the Australian ABC, And the Indonesian media, we all fell for it. We interviewed him, we broadcast his hate speech in Indonesia, all over the world. And we made him a famous superstar. When he came out of jail, he was going around giving sermons, full house, across the country. And that's because the media, we didn't have a strategy. We fell for it. He sells news. And we turned him into a superstar, famous, and he made a lot of money giving speeches. But I think we learned our lessons, that we know that the radicals, the extremists are out there and they're exploiting us. So over time we learn our lessons, and at least in Jakarta Post we stopped airing the views as newsworthy as they are. We only broadcast the stories about them when they break laws, when they commit violence, but not when they are airing their propaganda. And I think that's a problem. Yeah.
So in relation to Indonesia, I mean, Jakarta Post is an English language, so you're not necessarily going to be the paper that speaks to kind of those who may be vulnerable to being drawn into an extremist narrative or group. Do you think there is within Indonesia a sufficient level of reflection of the kind of perhaps quite angry voices who may want legitimate outlet to hear what they're saying, which if they aren't heard, then they become more vulnerable to capture, if you like, or attraction to more extremist groups. So is the media actually reflecting the diversity of perspectives, including those who are most kind of economically or politically frustrated in the country?
Yeah, I think we, the media, try to. Indonesia now is a democracy. We are an open and free society. We have press freedom, and we are using that to the most. Not just to, some of us fell into the trap of airing what sells news. But I think most of the established media, we have learned our lessons. And we value the freedom that we have, and we are using that. And I like you mentioned about giving voice to the voiceless. We are also doing that. But I think we are also filtering the voice of the radicals. But it's not really for us. Like I said, it's now, especially with the internet. I think the internet becomes an open marketplace for ideas and ideologies. Anything goes to the most extreme, most radical views and ideologies that are out there. And there's nothing we can do. I don't think the government can do anything about it. This is not China, where they can actually censor the internet. Even in China, I don't think the censorship is effective. So there is no point in us trying to curtail those voices. And I think my own opinion is that to fight those voices is to fight in the internet. That's the battleground really for people to fight and to win the hearts and minds and souls of the people. Now there are many, I wouldn't say many, there are some lost souls among the young people in Indonesia, and some of them fell for the ISIS propaganda. They saw the YouTube, they fell for it, and they went to Syria and joined the ISIS. But I should caution you that we should not exaggerate the numbers. The last figure that I had was there were 700 Indonesians who went to Syria. I'm sure the figure has probably gone up since then. But out of that 700, this is the police figure, actually only 200 were young men. The other 500 are women and children. And they fell for the idea of an Islamic caliphate because they saw on YouTube, live like a real Muslim, come to IS, or Islamic State. And they went there. And some of them, I can tell, they came back disappointed because it's not what they thought it was going to be. The number is pretty small. In Indonesia, 250 million people. Of that, I think 220 million would be Muslims. 200 young men going to become jihadis. It's pretty small compared to, let's say, Europe or other countries in terms of the proportion.
So there's a sense then that this isn't such a huge issue in Indonesia. I mean, there's an issue of radicalization, but it's not such a huge issue as is being kind of...
It's a problem that we need to deal with. but like I said, we should not exaggerate because by and large Indonesians with access to the internet, they're pretty smart. They look at the choices, they have access to all kinds of views, ideas, ideologies, and if the figure speaks about the number of that 200 speaks, it's a reflection of how many people fell for the ISIS ideology. It's pretty small.
Okay, Nasser. So I presented a bit of an analysis right at the start. Interrogate that, add to it. What's your kind of sense of where all this is going at the moment?
Well, first I'd like to thank you and JFMD for hosting me. I mean, I would sort of, in the interest of time, just cut to the chase. CVE, as it is conceived today, particularly by the United States, is the new alchemy. The conception is violently divorced from the realities of what actually radicalizes people. And it tries to come up with this sort of a magical pill that will prevent people in various areas of the globe from getting radicalized, which is rather a strange use of resources, because it's simply like the phenomenon that we're dealing with is very complex. And there are vast differences of what radicalizes somebody in North America versus somebody in Western Europe versus somebody in the Middle East. These are actually the areas that I generally look at and I know a thing or two about. Obviously, also that's very different from what would drive radicalization in the Far East. I mean, as you just heard now from the gentleman, Indonesia, the biggest Muslim nation on earth, with a population with over 220 million Muslims, out of 250, only 200. And you compare that, for example, with Belgium, which had a disproportionately high number. It's like several orders of magnitudes beyond that. The problem with CVE, as it is conceived right now, and unfortunately the United States is like sort of under the leadership of the Obama administration, is sort of setting the trend globally, and governments in the European Union are following suit, engaging in adopting some of these sort of concepts. It's just simply it is not working as evidenced by the events on the ground. There are plots every day. There are people getting radicalized even in the United States, in Western Europe. And I think that if I were to put my finger on sort of a crucial or most critical part of this, and there are so many critiques that could be made on the point, is that fundamentally, these governments have failed to be able to reach and communicate with the target audience. And that is quite remarkable given the amount of resources that is being deployed on this. And as a matter of fact, this might sound a little bit shocking to the audience, but if you were an investor, a business investor, and you looked at the amount of expenditure by Western government into countering radicalization, and you compared ISIS's operation and the expenditure, most business investors would go invest in the ISIS model because it's a lot more effective. And my contention is that actually we can learn from the way ISIS itself does its propaganda, and we can even we can beat them at their own game. But for that to happen, we need buy-in from political authorities and also from larger societal players, like particularly from the private sector and civil society.
Okay, but let's just challenge that just for a moment. So sure. There were two things, big things I took away from that. First of all, the issue is complex, and that magic, simple bullets don't work. Certainly a lot of the conversations I think many of us have had with decision makers, people who are funding different initiatives, is they say, okay, please don't tell us it's complex. We kind of know it's complex, but we have to be doing something, and we have to be seen to be doing something. Give us something more practical that allows us to actually do something useful rather than just telling us that we don't understand the issue and it's too complicated. And so that's one issue. And the second issue is, the big takeaway you were saying is play ISIS at its own game. Is that right? Isn't a reason for propaganda, the extremist propaganda works, is because it taps into identity, political and economic marginalization, frustration that I just want to get on in my life and the established system is not allowing me to do that, and grievance and all the things that an extremist agenda can exploit. And it's impossible, isn't it, for a counter effort, to tap into the same senses of grievances and identities, because they haven't got the same, their offer is don't do this, or believe in something better, or a more progressive agenda, which just isn't going to, as you say, if you want to know your audience, isn't going to resonate with them.
Okay, so on the first point, and I'll ask you to remind me of the other two. I'm still jet lagged. On the first point, when I say the issue is very complex and is a serious matter, it's not merely a rhetorical point. Are you familiar with Abu Musab al-Suri?
I've mentioned it only because you mentioned it yesterday.
Okay, so Abu Musab al-Suri is a jihadi theoretician, and he's written a manual that is over 800 pages, detailing how to conduct the project of jihad, chasing out foreign powers, taking over societies, and basically ultimately bring that vision of an Islamic state as he understands it into reality. So that's a fact. Just merely dismissing this, saying, oh, don't tell us that this is complicated and complex, that and $1.50 is not going to buy me a coffee, might sound like an emotional outburst. We're dealing with a serious problem here, and sort of the enemy that we're dealing with has put a lot of effort, resources, and time thinking this through. Whereas the guys on our sides clearly have not, because they have been beaten and caught unawares at every turn of events. Starting from, and if I were to deploy here an American-centric standpoint, starting from the bombings of the embassies in 96, 9/11, and beyond. I'll tell you, share with you a personal experience. Actually, I was detained 8 days after 9/11 in an FBI raid. And one of sort of the most mind-boggling things that happened, I'm talking here September 18th, 2001. And one of the FBI officers that was interrogating me and others sincerely and earnestly asked me whether Saddam Hussein was behind this, and tried to argue that point, and then ultimately asked me, so how do you know it's Al-Qaeda? This is in 2001. And I was like, well, I watch TV and they declared war on you in 1996. Didn't you see it? So the fact here is that we're dealing we need to be as serious as these guys in the way they pursue it. And the first marker of being serious is to actually sit down and go over their literature, understand it and deconstruct it. Now, in terms of pardon my selective hearing, I'm going to jump to the third point. In terms of propaganda or counter-propaganda, personally, I think that part of another critical part of why the current CVE efforts are failing and failing miserably is the refusal to acknowledge that what we're dealing with is the new global counterculture. This is not just a bunch of Illuminati sitting in a cave, and as evidenced by that, as an evidence to that, increasingly there is a trend of people getting radicalized who do not look like me and who's not called Nasser. They actually look like you, and their names were John and Mark and Olivia. And that's sort of the most important thing to bear in mind here, and to understand sort of the effectiveness and sort of how lethal this ideology has been, because it basically provides an answer to an ANSI generation that is like post-globalized, postmodern, that is completely disillusioned, got to the point to be disillusioned with the modern world, the actual world we live in. And somebody offered them a solution by appealing to their idealistic side and sort of making the promise that they can be new empire builders.
So you could argue the conclusion from that is actually that a lot of the people in this room are not terribly relevant to this debate. Is that it's so that your feeling is that kind of all this high-minded talk about independent media, independent public debate, creating more facts, more trusted information, and so on, tackling corruption or whatever.
I will not dance around this or be diplomatic about it. I'm frankly conflicted, because part of me is very committed to, why am I doing this? Because I believe in liberal democracy, and I think it's the best system available today. So freedom of the press, free speech, all these things are the things that actually one is fighting to preserve, because when we're dealing with ISIS and Islamist extremists, violent extremists, we're not like, this is not about stopping a plot, the next plot or the next hijacking. What this is about is standing up for the values of democracy, liberal democracy to be precise, and the freedoms that come with them. Now, I am conflicted because I don't think that I have the ultimate answer, and I'm not sure I will find the ultimate answer in my lifetime. But what I know is that we're at war. This is not peacetime. This is 1992. And the world as we know it has changed 3 times over. And as a matter of fact, this might be a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, but nonetheless it feeds back to understand why I am so alarmed and why I have such a drastic view. The values of liberal democracy have not been, and democracy itself have not been under so much pressure since the 1930s. And Islamist violence is one of the major drivers that are helping those in the world to make the case against liberal democracy.
So let me bring in Courtney, and I'm going to perhaps paraphrase a potential conclusion from what you're saying, which may be unfair.
Ideology.
So you could argue a conclusion of what Nasser's saying is that there is an information war, there's a war, and a part of that is an information war, and the reason the West is not winning it is it's just not doing it right. But nevertheless, it is engaged in a war, and that actually a lot of principles and beliefs that this community holds dear are relevant to that, but are actually not the main players in that. So Courtney, you've been researching this, I know, including for a report from the National Endowment for Democracy. What's your take on the whole issue and what you've heard too?
So definitely the idea of countering violent extremism is very badly defined. It's badly defined in the UN strategy, in the US approach, et cetera. It was hard enough to fight terrorism, and now we are fighting extremism. Oftentimes the violent part even gets dropped off. So this is certainly a battleground of ideas, and I think that you can't also separate it from the kind of Russian propaganda aspect. We are certainly in an era of information wars, of subjectivity in which there are very few facts. Nonetheless, there is an international agenda now around countering violent extremism, and as you alluded to, policymakers feel that they must be seen to be doing something, and what can be visible. Things that are being done in prisons are not visible. Preventing people from traveling, the real things that prevent people from joining ISIS are not visible. But having some, messaging campaign online that they can point to and show Congress or, show the taxpayers is very visible. But actually this goes back to, I think what both Nasser and Andy were saying is the media has a role to play, and what the governments are doing has clearly been shown to be counterproductive in the fight against extremism. So both Kate Ferguson's review as well as literature reviews funded by US government funding, for example, the START Center, and my own review of the literature, all of the literature reviews show that government-funded counter-narrative programs are ineffective. They do not work, and they are often counterproductive. In fact, because they undermine the idea that media are independent. One example would be Afghanistan, where tens of millions of dollars were poured in by the US State Department and USAID into developing independent media. But then hundreds of millions of dollars was poured in by the Pentagon to counter propaganda and to counter narratives, and essentially paying certain stations to give the news that they wanted. So what is the impact of that? Most most viewers around the world are not going to be like, oh, well, that was, the Pentagon and this was USAID, so we'll believe this media but not that media. No, it discredits all media. It discredits the idea that media are independent, that they are not beholden to whoever is funding them, et cetera. And this has long-term negative impacts on media development and on democracy more broadly, this idea that there is no independent, there is no objective media. I think furthermore, we're seeing that this idea of counter-narratives is also accompanied by the idea of censorship, by the idea that extremist views should not be allowed to be expressed. This is primarily playing out online. So we're seeing that there are efforts, and going back to this point about the assault on liberal democracy, it's actually the liberal democracies, United States, the EU, the UK, who are assaulting and actually promoting censorship online by calling for the removal and takedown of so-called extremist content. Who's extremist? What is extremist content? They're calling for private companies like Facebook, like Google, like Microsoft to take down accounts and content that they consider extremist. Now, usually they say extremist, but what they're really talking about is ISIS. Well, what happens there? First of all, if you remove the accounts, they get pushed into private encrypted chat rooms or applications where they become talking to each other in an echo chamber and therefore get no alternative viewpoints. It doesn't allow journalists to see what is happening, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. And we're already seeing this. Both in China and Egypt have adopted censorial practices and specifically referenced the US calls to take down this information. So the long-term implications of that are also disturbing.
But, you could argue, from a point of view of someone who is tasked with countering extremism and violence, the takeaway from what you just said is, independent media independent spaces for debate, independent media, we need to protect these things, and actually a lot of the rest of what you're doing isn't working. So it doesn't seem to be a solution, does it? What's for, if you were in their shoes, what would you be doing?
Well, here's the problem. So I've been at several expert debates by the UN, by the OSCE, and by the Global Network Initiative that brought together stakeholders. And overwhelmingly, what the civil society people are saying is that these programs don't work, you shouldn't do them. But they're already ingrained in the UN strategy, in the USAID, State Department, CVE strategy, in the British, Resolve strategy. So there's almost no rolling back, no matter how many times we've said, this is a waste of money. What could be a good use of money would be not focusing on the content, but actually on the reception of the content. So improving media and information literacy, which not only could accrue value to countering violent extremism, but also to general political involvement. And I think they're also missing the point that ISIS, when it recruits using online tools, it's not like they post a tweet and someone's like, oh my God, let me go join ISIS. They showed that an ISIS recruiter spends an average of 30 hours engaging with an individual. This is not about what we're posting online, it's about an individual relationship. And furthermore, if you look at the programs that are being created under this countering violent extremism agenda, let's look at the Don't Be a Puppet campaign by the FBI, which essentially it's aimed at high school students, and it says, don't be a puppet, don't get recruited, and report on people if you see that, are they not supportive of US foreign policy? Have they traveled to odd places in the past few months? Are they ardent supporters of environmental or animal rights? This is deeply disturbing. So we're creating an environment where people are very skeptical of each other, and where actually the moderate voices, or even voices who want to argue for a different type of system, can't, because they're silenced. There are Muslim students who do not feel comfortable speaking out against American foreign policy, and then what happens? They're not going to be on the media. The media can't find those voices, so they're going to find the extremist radical voices, both on the far right and potentially on the far left.
I think it's quite striking from actually all the panelists, and I think where the debate is at is part of this is a conversation about principle and values, and a lot of the conversation is about evidence and actually what's working. And I think what all of you are saying and is that a lot of what's being invested at the moment isn't working. And let's have a conversation about what works as well as a conversation about what's right, and vice versa. I want to open it up, but can I just, I know that we have a Lieutenant Colonel from the Indonesian police in a room, and it would be great to, I don't know where he is, but it would be great to hear your perspective on this in terms of what you've heard, and please introduce yourself and say a little bit about what your experience is in relation to what you've the debate we've been having. Have we got a microphone? Yes, okay.
Thank you very much, moderator and speakers. I was talking about the current situation in terrorism in Indonesia. From my experience, I'm from in the field, and for the counterterrorism since 2005 until now, and then for the just sharing information for all of the members of the Jakarta World Forum, and recently the Indonesian terrorist development is related with the foreign terrorist fighter, Indonesian foreign terrorist fighter in Syria. Until now, what you call this, Mr. Bayuni, about the January attack, and then Solo, suicide bomber, and the last is Medan. This is influenced by the guys in Syria from Indonesia. All of the terrorist networking, they make order for the make small cell in Indonesia, and then to become trainer and to make communication, all of them through the social media and messenger group in WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook, and everything. This is very dangerous for me because we cannot monitoring about that. For the real in the field, we can just monitoring physically, but for the communication, everything is cannot just secret and with the encryption and everything. And also, like the Tamrin attack and suicide bomber, part by parts for the action to influence by the Bahru Naim. This is the guys from Solo, and in 2015 traveled to Syria, and until now we just monitor it from my side, Indonesian citizen to join with the ISIS and Jabal al-Nusra in Syria and Iraq, more than 500. Just as depend based from the investigated, but from the intelligent maybe more. And until now we just monitor. Also we back from FTF make returnees back to Indonesia. Until now 47 we just monitoring, and then maybe for deported from the other countries, maybe around the 300 people will be back in Indonesia. And for my job will be monitoring and controlling for the activities, for their activities. And media for terrorists is very, I think that's a basic need for the terrorists, because terrorists want to propaganda what they do, and then how to the recruit for the member will join to ideology. This is media is very good way to make the propaganda. And then for the my hopes is reducing the impact for the terrorism report of media is very responsibility, and then we can make, if the terrorists will make activity, and then they waiting for the media to blow up what they do, because fear of crime, this is the purposes for the successful by the media. If the media we cannot reduce, or we cannot significant choose what the good news for the public. And also media crews that involving the terrorism reports has to have awareness and willingness to reducing the adverse effect from the news they delivers, and then does not have to publicly report it, the details and the illustration concerning chronology, ordinance action, how terrorists raise funds and ideology, which can be an example, and then maybe to get improve the strategy content, strengthen nationalism, ideology, encouragement, solidarity, respecting, and to more tolerance. And the Indonesian national strategic, we have two lines, which is a soft approach and the hard approach. The approach will be start from the 2002, after the the first Bali bombing, and the law enforcement lead strategy until now. But the strategy until now we cannot. This is success for the arrested the terrorists, but for the reduce the ideology or radicalization, I am not sure. Because we are until now just many people to make ideology or radical ideology, and then we cannot reduce. That's okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Andy, can I just ask you to reflect on what you've heard, and particularly this issue which we haven't really covered, as the degree to which the media is kind of playing the game of the radicals by paying so much attention and sensationalizing, arguably, a lot of what they're doing, and actually drawing publicity to them. Is that or anything else you've heard kind of strike a chord?
Yeah, thank you. I think the police job is really with regards to law enforcement. Yeah. It's not their job to counter the propaganda that we see in ISIS. That would be, I think, the government, but not so much the police. And there have been cases when the intelligence agency asked the Ministry of Communication to shut down a number of websites because they were perceived as radicals. But I don't think it's working. Yeah? If anything, the moment that the government announced these websites are radicals, more and more people, actually, you are driving more traffic into the, and they will find ways. Any attempt to ban or shut down websites is actually, you become part of the marketing tool for those websites. This happens all the time, consistently. So I don't believe in censorship. The government is kind of divided in this. I think that some agencies believe that there should be more censorship in the internet, but I think there's a counter view that it's not working. So there's still a big debate. The problem is this. I think, again, I agree with Courtney about the difficulties in defining what is extremism and what is radicalism. So some people, the desire to have an Islamic state is a radical view. But that means you are saying that something like 15 or 20% of Indonesians have radical views. Those aspirations, for me, they're legitimate. And some of these people who believe that Indonesia should be an Islamic state, they fight the battles through the democratic process. They form political parties, they campaign, and they win some seats, but they have never won a majority. My mom would vote for one of those parties because she believes that Indonesia should be governed under the Sharia and it should be an Islamic state. And she's not radical. So there is, those voices are legitimate. Even the most extreme views, I would say, they are legitimate as long as they don't resort to the use of violence. When they turn to violence, the use of force, and that would be for the job of the police to deal with. But you cannot censor the internet, and if anything, if you try to censor the internet, it's going to be counterproductive. You are going to drive more people to the extreme views. The best thing is to let, going back to the question about what should the government be doing, I'm not sure about what in the West, but I think in Indonesia, I would say the government should ensure that there is press freedom, there is internet freedom, but also make sure, someone mentioned about media literacy, internet literacy, that people know how to use the internet wisely, and also maybe instead of engaging in propaganda or getting the media to help the state propaganda, help the religious organizations build the capacity in using the internet. At the moment, I can tell you they are losing the battle of the internet because the radicals, the extremist groups, they are far, far more savvy in using the media, and they're winning recruits. I turned to the websites of the two largest Islamic organizations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. I can tell they're very boring. There are very people, it's very preachy and it's not appealing. But you go to the websites of ISIS or the organizations in Indonesia that subscribe to the ISIS ideas, they are far, far better.
Okay, I want to open it up, but I know Courtney wants to say something. But if people can go to the microphone, and I'm looking for both questions but also interventions, your thoughts. Please keep them relatively brief. But please, if you can start queuing up at the microphone, it's probably the easiest thing. Courtney, just while people do that.
Just to build on that idea, I mean, the ISIS media operations is very sophisticated. They have a clearinghouse, they have several different channels across different platforms. They know how to produce a piece of content and cut it up in different ways to produce it for Facebook, for Twitter, for YouTube, et cetera. And most of the organizations that the media development community is working with are struggling just to maintain a website, or much less to do video, et cetera. So we have to also think about, imagine if some of the money that was going to these silly counter-narrative programs and the idea of equating the number of clicks or likes with impact actually went to supporting independent media organizations to be more effective in disseminating their information. That actually might be very helpful.
Do you agree with that, by the way? Just before we...
I'm always at a crossroad. I'm sort of the guy who's negotiating constantly with the freedom community and trying to get them and the counterterrorism community to have middle grounds. Yes, I think that in the current environment, it's more effective to give money to organizations, grassroots organizations that have no ties to the government to disseminate content, than trust it to the Pentagon or the State Department. That is an utter waste of my tax dollars.
Okay, let's open it up. So, yes, please. And if you go to the microphone too, I just want to get a few interventions too.
Yeah. Milica Pešić, Media Diversity Institute, London. I have a comment and I have a question for Nasser. Since we've been working in this field of diversity for almost 20 years, I would say that media have contributed a great deal to the exclusion of what you, James, called marginalized groups. When we analyzed media in Europe for 2 years, it came out that European, and I'm talking about European Union particularly, European editors still believe that Europe is only Christian and only white. And if we are saying that about European Union media, imagine how it could be in some other parts of the world. In Arab countries, we've been monitoring media for almost 7 years. They don't dare to show that there is diversity within Islam. We have analyzed how media in Egypt, cover non-Muslim communities, how they exclude them. But when we suggested, let's see how diversity within Islam has been covered, it was like, don't go that way. So there is no one pill, one drug for all media. It has to be looked in different countries and different cultures how to respond. But it's not enough to have a little ghetto in your media outlet for this particular community. It's past in journalism, but it's still been practiced in many countries. It is to bring pensioners in any segment of the news bulletin when you talk about taxes. Why only talking about pensioners when there is something happening in that particular community? And if we talk about Muslims. So it is the responsibility of the media to do good journalism. And good journalism does mean provide space, include, bring diverse groups into the mainstream whenever you talk about the issues relevant to all citizens.
But just to check on what you're saying, I mean, you could be taken to argue from what you're saying was if only the media had been better at reflecting a range of perspectives, a range of different views, we wouldn't have a radicalization problem. And is that true? I mean,
No, James, we are talking about the media and role of media. I'm not talking about the governments. I'm talking about the media, and we have to take responsibility as journalists for what we have not done it, and what we can do if we want to practice journalism as we claim it should be practiced. And I have all moral rights to talk about it because I had to leave my own country when I was refused to do the job I believe should be done, particularly during the war, particularly when we had people of different religions being pushed into the war in the Balkans. So I'm talking about the media, we are not doing a good job. And when we talk about BBC, which I respect very much, and I think it's one of the best media outlets in the world, not perfect. So British public is media literate enough to actually hear what the other side thinks. Why excluding extremists? We are mystifying them. I think they are humans like everyone else, and if someone who understands extremism, who is familiar with Islam as religion, who can have a normal debate with these people, it would be less mystified than, don't put them in our program.
Okay, your question for Nasser.
Question for Nasser. Being born in a communist country, Nasser, when you started describing how ISIS has been building up and becoming what it is, it reminded me very much on how communism started. And, bringing together dispossessed, poor, marginalized, and then international brigades joining in so please comment.
Turn.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's actually, for me, in my experience, it's been always, maybe somebody ought to look at this more closely. It's been always easier for me to explain sort of the emergence of the jihadi global counterculture to natives of Eastern Europe, particularly those who were born under communist rule. Because there is a similarity, because modern jihadism is basically what communism used to be in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This promise of a new world, the promise of a new order that's going to be more equal, egalitarian, just, and that will address some of the injustices in the world. That is exactly it. And oftentimes, I think what is really interesting in my own personal experience is that when I make this point to natives of Western Europe, of a certain age, like below 50, they don't quite get it.
Okay, let's just take a few interventions, but there's one other thing you said which I just want to...
Because they've taken their freedoms for granted.
But there's just one other thing I think we ought to come back to in a minute, but one of the other things you said is this kind of, actually, how do people understand each other? How do people who are different from each other actually get to understand better the realities of the other? And the other big trend, I think the other big issue facing the media development community, which has been endlessly talked about, is the growth of a much more fragmented, compartmentalized, polarized media space in which people go to their own information, create or search for their own facts, and where it's actually increasingly difficult to encounter the perspectives of those who are different from them. And we should probably come back, because I think that's a central concern for the media development community. And I think this is another fundamental issue in relation to creating a more polarized and sometimes more extreme world. But please, let's have a series, and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Maria Ressa from Rappler. I'm focused more on Southeast Asia. This year, we saw a lot more messages coming out through central ISIS propaganda machines, AMAC, but Southeast Asian messages, the most recent one in June telling people to come to the Philippines, telling the jihadists to come to the Philippines. I'm curious, a question for Pak Didi, Courtney, Bambang. How connected are these messages that are coming through? What can be done about it, Courtney? And then Bambang, how would you recommend media? Because right now, AMAC is not known in our region. How do we report it without amplifying the propaganda machinery? Please, sir, if you can respond first.
Thank you very much for comment or opinion from my colleagues from Philippines. For my opinion is media for counter propaganda is very we want to very close cooperation with from government to media, because for all of propaganda may be terrorists through the media. Until now, we cannot doing anything about to reduce the radical propaganda or terrorist propaganda from the media. We just monitoring, and then we just, for example, if I have and from National Counterterrorism Agency or the police, we have a website for the most moderate website and Islamic moderate website. If we looking for showing the how many person to invite or searching the website to be less than for the radical website. Radical websites to be more or most biggest to join the website. This is very important to make a communication and cooperation with media and government. And in the NCT or the police also, until now we just engage the media and public sector and community, public community or NGO, everything to involve the counter narrative, and then to counter propaganda and counter radicalization through the media and also with the academics, even our seminar and like the forum like this. Okay, thank you.
So that, yeah.
So I wanted to give a concrete example very quickly on one of the biggest issues of why the current conception of CVE is violently divorced from reality. Who here in the room about a month and a half was following the news from Aleppo, Syria? By show of hands. Okay. How many people heard any news reports explaining that the Western coalition and Russia ultimately failed? I mean, Russia is actually on the part of the problem, but particularly the Western coalition ended up in a situation where 350,000 civilians in Aleppo who were faced with the threat of starvation sieges and aerial bombing were ultimately, at least for a period of time, saved and fed and kept secure by jihadi elements. That's how farcical the situation is today. Basically, the Western world, the free world, has abdicated through the incredibly incompetent and, by the way, self-sabotaging, self-defeating policies coming out of my government and government in Western Europe are fueling this problem. Now, the real question is like, how many editorials have you read that made that point? How many 7 o'clock p.m. Central newscasts started opening up by the title, Jihadis Save the Day, Where's the West? So that's the job for the editorial rooms.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment.
Can I reply?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, where's Maria? Okay, my name is Andy, not Bambang. You keep calling me Bambang. Anyway, you asked a valid question. How should we, the media in Indonesia, in the Philippines, or in Southeast Asia, report about the activities of the propaganda of these radical terrorist groups? It's hard when you have to, when you're only given 400 or 500 words to explain the very complex issues. And sometimes we fell for that, and we ended up spreading their propaganda. On complex stories like this, I think Rappler is doing a good job, your media is doing a good job in explaining. So we should not shy away from reporting the activities of these radical groups. In fact, we have an obligation to do that. But I think we should also explain what they really are. Give them the history of the murders, the killings, and all the other things that they have been involved in. And explain that to the audience. And I think that way, we are doing our job as a media in reporting about what is happening. But the challenge is always in getting that story in as few words as possible, because space and all those things.
I want to come back to the floor, but very quickly,
Yeah,
Courtney.
just to add to that, I think the idea of having diverse voices is important, because if you only hear Muslim voices when they have to talk about whether, what is the meaning of the Amaq magazine that's now targeting Philippines, this is going to be problematic. You need to hear these voices in the human interest stories, in the culture stories, in society stories, and not just the idea that there is one Islamic voice, but many different, types of Muslims. There are secular Muslims, there are, a diverse
Cultural Muslims.
Okay, so I'm hearing, from NASA, truth is important, regardless of how inconvenient it may be. I'm hearing that actually moderate spaces for public debate are kind of important, actually maybe arguably more important than an information, than a kind of counter-propaganda, which is quite kind of, I think, resonant with this audience I mentioned. Yes, please, can we have some comments or questions?
My name is Harry. I'm from Universitas Multimedia Nusantara. I have two short questions for the speaker and practitioner. First, as a lecturer, as a people who work in academic, we prepare the next generations of journalists. What kinds of insight can you give to us so we can prepare them better to deal with this? We try to expose them with diversity in the classroom, but is it enough, or is there any insight from the practitioner? What should we teach to our next journalists? And second, about I want to hear more about the CVE, because from what I heard, the problem with CVE is from the source. If the source is the government or FBI, etc., they lose the credibility. Here in the university, we try to empower the community. So we try to equip the moderate Muslim organization, teach them how to produce content. Is it good enough, or is it successful, or is it things that we can do, or there's more than we can do here in academic? Thank you.
Okay, some advice for journalists. Andy, do you want to go first, and just very briefly, because I want to get...
Yeah, well, my short question is, I think media journalists, we should pay more attention to religion. I know it's a difficult issue, it's an issue that we all want to avoid, but I think we should not avoid that. I think part of the problem, you talk about the problems of diversity, we are not reflecting that if we are not reporting about the religious, the different faiths that exist in our society. You mentioned that I founded the International Association of Religion Journalists, and these journalists from 23 different countries, we learn that we are part of the problem because we stereotype, we bring our prejudices when we report about religions, and to, at the expense of the minorities in our respective societies, the Islamophobia, the hatred against Christianity, Judaism, the fight between the Muslims in India and the Hindus. Part of that, if you look carefully, actually they have been fueled by the media. So this is why, if my answer about for journalist students, maybe for the university, maybe you should look into the question, the possibility of teaching, reporting on religion as one of the curriculum.
Yes.
So you can teach about context. The context that you choose to put your story in is very important. You can choose to write a story about how many likes some ISIS Facebook page got. You can choose to write a story about what Trump has said about Muslims, and then you can choose the context that you put that in. Are you going to mention how many civilians have been killed by ISIS? Are you going to mention that everything Donald Trump has said about Muslims is absolutely false? You choose the context. So remember, you have to frame these and don't give false equivalence to some of these issues.
And just to take my moderator hat off for a minute, it's not advice, but don't underestimate the importance of what you might be doing and the role you might be playing in the future. There are a lot of journalists who go on to, I imagine, we've heard already from this school, who won't go on to be journalists, they'll be going on to do public relations and other things. Journalism in the future, however difficult and challenging and even potentially quite poorly paid it's going to be, is going to be absolutely key to the future of this country and of a world, including around fundamental issues of democracy and of tackling, I think, these kinds of issues. And it's in danger, it is in peril, and there is a world in which we are awash with messages. And we are in an information, if we're not in an information war, we're certainly in an information struggle. And actually journalists who actually exist to serve a public and actually exist to reflect the perspectives of all in society and are not there to simply to reflect the perspectives of any particular paymaster from one side or another, are an increasingly rare breed. And I just would say, do not underestimate just how important public interest journalism, however you want to define it, is going to be in the future. Because if this conversation proves anything to me, that's going to be vital in the future. So stick with it, I would say, to a young journalist, however tough that's going to be. You'll probably curse me for saying that later.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Murad Taib. I'm a journalist from Tunisia, and I cover Tunisia and Libya. I've been working on ISIS-related issues in the past few years, mainly for the broadcast media, and I noticed that in the international media, and consequently the international public opinion, there are a lot of misconceptions and inaccuracies when talking about this issue. And I'd like quickly to share some of these thoughts I discovered when talking or when watching documentaries and news worldwide. To start with, I will ask how many journalists or reporters have met former ISIS fighters who came back to Tunisia after quitting ISIS. I don't know of any journalist or reporter who met them. I did. So I think it's very good. It's a very good idea to talk to them and to see why they joined and why they left. This is one thing. Second thing is about the figures of jihadists, so-called jihadists in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. I remember when some people angry with these revolutions in the Arab world, those who lost power, started publishing and talking about figures, numbers of Tunisian jihadists in Syria. And most of these figures are not accurate. Just to tell the world that these revolutions are a mistake, they produced many jihadists. So there are no accurate figures. And I remember one big media, one Western TV, famous TV, said, the United Nations said that there are this and this 1,000 fighters in Syria from Tunisia. And I called the United Nations office in Tunis, do you have something like that? They said no. They didn't release any figure. They just said Tunisians are among the biggest nationalities in ISIS. That's it. Something else, we should bear in mind that there are many parties, many players in this ISIS issue. We shouldn't be superficial. I will tell you, recently, Fallujah was cleared up from ISIS fighters. We were told so. Sirte is being emptied from ISIS fighters. I was in Sirte a few weeks ago. We assume that there are 100,000 ISIS fighters in Sirte, maybe hundreds of thousands in Fallujah. Has anybody saw bodies of those killed or those captured? Hundreds of thousands have been taken out of Fallujah and Sirte, and the media doesn't show bodies, dead people, or captured people. Okay. Where are they?
Nasser, answer that. No, but actually, I want to ask a question too. But Nasser.
Yeah, I would like to react to that very quickly. Just an anecdote here. I mean, it's not an anecdote; it's a fact.
Can I finish, please? One just ready. I'm finishing. Yeah. We see there was an American airstrike in Sabrata, Libya, in February 2015, 19th of February, and they said they killed 50 big names of Tunisian jihadists in Sirte, among them Nordin Shushan, known to many of them. I will tell you, Nordin Shushan and many, many others in the international media and in the Tunisian media, they were killed many times. They were captured many times. They were imprisoned many times. Okay. Every strike, we captured Nordin Shushan, we killed Nordin Shushan. Then he is in Tunis, then he is in Mosul, then he is in Syria. Okay. So I'm saying this because we are the first. How can we ask the public opinion to be precise and accurate and be careful and not ask this from ourselves? We should be careful when dealing with this issue. We should try to be as close as possible to the ground. I know it's dangerous, but there are ways and there are people who can help us get accurate information on the ground.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
So very quickly, the last point the gentleman referred to is that basically amongst counterterrorism analysts, there's an ongoing joke, which was the number 3 of Al-Qaeda was killed. Starting 2004, literally every 2 weeks, the number 3 of Al-Qaeda was killed. And it's still ongoing, by the way. And the second thing is that basically, per the figures of the Department of Defense, the Pentagon claims that they have killed over 45,000 ISIS fighters, whereas the general estimate a year ago was that all of ISIS in Syria and Iraq had 35,000 people. So how did you kill 45,000 and they're still fighting?
So you're saying, I mean, you know, what you're fundamentally the issue here is that, if you like, a Western narrative is losing credibility.
It's not only losing credibility, it's that Western journalists are supremely gullible.
Okay.
They eat up anything the Pentagon and the White House tell them.
All right.
I want to address the issue of journalists on the ground, because that's very important. But I think everyone here knows that the past 4 years have been the most dangerous on record for journalists ever. More journalists being killed and imprisoned, many times because of ISIS. But what we're also seeing, the impact of CVE is on the ground for journalists. Journalists are being equated with extremists, are being accused of extremists because they are speaking with extremists, with ISIS fighters, with the Mujahideen, with the Muslim Brotherhood, whoever the terrorist group du jour is for whatever given government that there is. They're not being allowed access into territory. You'll see that journalists in Turkey, for example, who are trying to report on southern Turkey are getting arrested. So the problem is that the impact of CVE is providing cover for repressive governments and for governments who want to restrict access or declare a certain opposition group terrorist groups, to restrict the ability of journalists to do journalism. And so we're seeing that acts of journalism are being equated with terrorism.
May I? Just 30 seconds?
Because
okay.
Very quickly. But
very quickly, I mean, Courtney, I really, really recommend that you watch French media and their reporting on ISIS. Completely cartoonish, science fiction, comedy stuff.
Well, I think it's very clear that the Arabic media was far advanced in reporting on ISIS. You could see the reports of foreign terrorist fighters in Syria at least 4 months in the Arabic media before you saw it in the English language media. So absolutely, you need the people on the ground. And that could be another recommendation to journalists, is you need to read each other in different languages.
Yes, please.
What a fantastic panel. 2 quick things. One, I've been coming to Indonesia for 30 years, and at the height of the Suharto government, we would have had a lot of commentary around the need for collaboration between governments and journalists and media organizations. If you look at the same scene in the late 1990s, any commentary about government media collaboration would have been howled down by an Indonesian audience. It's really interesting that that discourse is again being legitimized now in the context of anti-terror activity, and the support for that is coming from what many of us have grown up regarding as the kind of mainland of democracy that is the United States. So I wondered whether either of you had any commentary about that. But just riffing off Courtney for a minute, you talked about the need to explain context, and I wonder, within the context of radicalism, we keep talking about religion and diversity, but whether it's actually inequality that we need to be talking about. Thanks.
Sorry, could you just repeat? Could you just say the last sentence again? I didn't hear it anyway.
In terms of the context, we keep hearing that we need to talk about diversity and explaining Islam, but is the real question about growing inequality?
Yeah, so let me clarify. I don't think that the context needs to be about Islam. It's about the context that you give. So if you are talking about, if you're writing about as a journalist, countering violent extremism programs online and counter-narrative programs, perhaps the context that you want to give is the statistical improbability that anyone who might be radicalized will actually get that piece of content. If you have, 1.5 billion people on Facebook, the likelihood that you're going to actually target the right person, even with 99.9% exactitude, you're still going to get 60,000 people that have no intention of being radicalized. And furthermore, with respect to context, I think all of the national strategies on CVE and the UN Action Plan recognize that there is no single driver of extremism, and that there's a great diversity of drivers. And so it's important to recognize the inequality of the experience of many different types of people, of Muslims, of African Americans, of whoever these audiences are. But I think we have to also go beyond that. And going back to what Nasser was saying earlier about the culture, it's not just that people are disenfranchised or that they're, economically underprivileged or they don't have a job. Millennials want to believe in something. Like, don't you remember when you were at college age and this is when you joined all the clubs, this is when you signed the petitions and you voted for the first time. You want to be part of something, and this is giving them something to be part of, something to believe in. And imagine if you had gone through a revolution, if you had gone through this amazing political uprising, and now you are seeing it stamped and crushed out. You want to believe in something. Similarly, in the US, I think we're also, missing that, in Europe. You want something to believe in. When you go and join ISIS, they give you a name. You were mentioning this yesterday, Nasser, they'll call them Al-Almani or Al-Britanni, which is saying, the British. And also they give actually the Al-Alami, which means media. So if you're working in the media, it's a form of jihad. They'll give you this honorific Al-Alami, which highlights your very important role of working in the media. Whereas in many of these countries, being a journalist is a very non-respected position. When I was doing my research in Egypt for my book, most people are not, were not allowed to be journalists or study journalism because it's not a respected profession. They needed to be engineers, doctors, or dentists.
Andy, first of all, and then...
Yeah, I'd like to take up your question about government and media collaboration, which we had during the Suharto years, but we dropped that. And now it seems that with CVE, the trend is going that direction. I don't know about in the States, but I think in Indonesia, it's the last thing we want to be seen as collaborating with the government, because then we would lose independence. I think when it comes to fighting radicalism, extremism, I think the media should feel that they have the responsibility to do that without prodding from the government. Because we are part of the society that we live in. We want to see peace. We want to see, harmony. And if so we should not wait for some CVE funding or government prodding that we should be engaging in fighting radicalism. We are doing that already automatically, and I think we are not doing perfectly. I think we could do much better, but I think we're doing that. The question about inequality, I think, of course, inequality is one reason why people are driven to extremism. I think you mentioned about corruption, poverty as well. But in Indonesia, I think if you look at the history of those people who became terrorists, it's those people, the usual suspects, that the aspiration for Indonesian Islamic State has always been there since day one we became independence. They have been there and they fought, they lost, and they went underground, and some of them became terrorists. It's the usual suspects. And of course, a few people who are middle class, they joined and went to ISIS. But I think the majority of the people who went to, come from one or two villages, and they're sort of related by marriage. Okay. And I think for the police, it probably makes the job easier.
Okay, Nasser, just hold your file. We've been given a timeout signal, but just for 2 more minutes, I just want to get this one more intervention, and then I'll make sure Nasser can speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel. I'm Victoria Marchenko from Ukraine. I was born and lived under communism, Nasser. For the last 22 years, I have been with USAID promoting democratic values.
Slava Ukraina.
Heroyam Slava. And as you know, our country is at war, and Russian propaganda played and is playing a huge role in this. And we will be discussing in details this at 4:30 session today about the communications Cold War in Eastern Europe. We probably made mistakes in countering war at all fronts, but USAID in Ukraine, Courtney, has taken the approach not to support counter-propaganda, but to support local, indigenous, responsible, trustworthy media organizations to produce true content. Several of them are here, at least 3. And we are also increasing support for such things as media literacy and civic education. Because after the collapse of communism, the gap in civic education has been for 25 years. Children have not been taught any values. My question is actually to Courtney, and what can we do to ensure accurate information about Ukrainian developments outside Ukraine? I've brought a couple of articles from Foreign Policy, from Atlantic Council, and many other international press that are not accurately reflective of the developments of Ukraine.
Okay, 20 seconds, Courtney, and then
I think you have to go on the ground. We sent our reporter twice to Ukraine to go on the ground to understand what journalists were facing there and then report on it. I think it's very hard to do that if you're only relying on secondary information sources, because as you said, there is a propaganda war going on. I'm sure there's much more to say, but that's 20 seconds.
In 20 seconds, I actually wanted to answer the lady before you, in terms of sort of whether the problem we're dealing with is a question of inequality of Islam. This is a very critical point and is imminently misunderstood. And a sort of example for that is like France. France is sort of the Western European nation that has the biggest Muslim community. And if you look at their policies that are ultimately culminated today, like in the creation of these re-education camps, I mean, literally Maoist, Stalinist type of thinking. Their political class is pursuing the question. They don't want to have the conversation about inequality, which is a serious driver. They want to make it about Islam, because that gets them off the hook from having the more difficult question, which is, why have they failed to absorb all of these populations in the last 5 decades?
Okay.
Can I just add on the USAID funding thing? I mean, this is very important, and it's important that they are funding independent media, but what the research is showing in the Center for International Media Assistance report that will be published next month, is that there is the perception that funding is going to CVE, and so you see the organizations working on the ground reshaping their programs to take advantage of that funding and to be seen as new avenues of funding. So it's really important that the media development community stick to their guns and not give in to just using CVE as a framework to gain access to new funding streams.
Okay, we have to stop, I'm sorry. This has been a great panel, and I had just written a kind of a final takeaway, which was the word stick to our guns. I think that, partly because there are a set of principles and a set of values that people in this room believe in, but also because those values and principles are actually the ones which seem to work. And I think this is the words which I've heard here which resonate most are trust, truth, credibility, a range of perspectives, reflecting a range of perspectives. Pay attention to your audiences. This is our bread and butter, and yet seems to be what most of the interventions have been focused on in terms of the things that are actually kind of most effective in tackling radicalization and extremism. So I think this community needs to be a lot more assertive, actually, and I think the overarching debate on radicalization and countering extremism, particularly countering violent extremism, needs to bring into the conversation a range of different perspectives from the more strategic communication, and also a defense and a diplomatic and so on, but this community too. We need a bigger joined up conversation. All of us need to be circumspect in this space. None of us have got the magic answer. But it's kind of important that there are successes achieved in this area. And I think this community has a huge amount, as the last hour and a half has demonstrated, a massive amount to offer this discussion about what actually works. And I don't think that's properly reflected in the international debate at the moment. A huge thank you to my panel. Thank you very much. I think it's been fantastic, been fascinating. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, but another round of applause to our great moderator, James Dean. Quick announcement, for probably some technical reasons, we have not received yet the video from meet people that we didn't have the chance to meet yet. So we will reconvene here at 11:30. And those of you who want to go to the other parallel sessions at 11:30 can also do so. And also, please do not forget to join us for dinner here, 6:30 p.m. It is a gala dinner provided by MNC Group with Mr. Hari Tanusudibu, CEO of MNC Group, who will be hosting us and addressing us tonight at 6:30. Thank you.